The night does not ask you to arrive alert. It does not expect conclusions. It only asks that you arrive slowly. This is not a story that rushes toward meaning. It is a collection of moments that learned how to exist without needing applause. Moments where strength stopped insisting, where cities learned to feed themselves quietly, where homes learned to breathe despite smoke and closeness, where people adjusted long before they ever admitted they had changed. Late-night history prefers these hours because history behaves differently when no one is watching closely. Ambition softens. Noise loses authority. The small habits begin to matter more than the dramatic events that textbooks favor. Tonight, we are not following heroes into battle or counting victories. We are watching how people learned to stand differently, how they learned when to stay, how they learned when to leave, how they learned that sometimes the most important decision is not to continue. You will notice something as this night unfolds. Nothing here explodes. Nothing resolves cleanly. Pressure accumulates without shouting. Adaptation replaces defiance. Life continues not because it wins, but because it learns where to stop pushing. This is a night of rain and lanterns, of bowls eaten standing, of smoke that refuses to leave the ceiling, of walls painted not to impress, but to endure, of footsteps that shorten without explanation, of silence doing the work speeches never could. If you are listening while the world finally quiets around you, that is not an accident. These stories were never meant to compete with your day. They exist to sit beside it gently until the edges soften. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to stay with us. There is no urgency here, no demand for attention. Only the steady continuation of nights like this one. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these hours to remain unhurried. It lets the lanterns keep rising. It lets the stories continue without needing to shout. Now the pace will slow further, the voice will lower, the moments will stretch just enough to be felt and then released. You do not need to remember anything. You do not need to reach an ending. You only need to let the night do what it has always done best. Now, rest. The light is low and nothing dramatic happens at first. That is usually how trouble begins in history. Not with shouting or banners, but with a quiet sense that the world is no longer cooperating. The Vikings were not people who expected cooperation. They expected resistance. They planned for it. Resistance was familiar and even comforting. It meant there was something solid to push against. You could see it, you could hit it, you could write a song about it later and make it sound productive. What they did not expect was inconvenience, a slow, draining kind of inconvenience that did not fight back properly, a landscape that refused to be impressed, a place where confidence kept walking forward but results stayed stubbornly behind. This was the moment when the map stopped being a promise and became a suggestion. Viking confidence had a particular shape. It was loud enough to feel permanent. They moved fast. They decided faster. Planning was brief because hesitation was considered a flaw rather than a tool. The sea made sense to them. It was dangerous but honest. Wind pushed. Waves resisted. You learned to read it or you drowned. That felt fair. Land was supposed to work the same way. You arrived. People noticed. People reacted. Something happened. In the north, that rhythm broke down. Ships waited patiently along the coast, doing nothing useful. Inland movement slowed. Sound behaved strangely. Footsteps felt too loud and voices felt too small. Snow absorbed noise in a way that made even a group of armed men feel oddly alone. Trees stood close together, as if they had been arranged on purpose to discourage large ambitions. This was not fear in the usual sense. No one screamed. No one ran. That would have been embarrassing. Instead, there was irritation, confusion, the subtle tension of spending energy without seeing progress. Vikings were comfortable spending effort if effort produced stories. Here, effort produced sweat and nothing else. That was unsettling in a way no enemy charge could match. Armor that looked impressive in open ground began to feel like a personal joke. Shields caught branches. Spears complained about limited space. Axes wanted room to swing and found none. Every step reminded you that you had brought too much metal into a place that preferred lighter arrangements. The forest did not care about reputation. It cared about whether you fit. The land did not announce danger. That was the problem. There were no clear signs to react to, no dramatic signals that allowed bravery to perform. Instead, there was the steady erosion of advantage. Navigation became uncertain. Tracks disappeared. Direction felt optional. Even the sky contributed nothing helpful. A flat gray overhead offered no guidance and no encouragement. People who lived there moved differently. They did not rush. They did not announce themselves. They appeared where they needed to be and were absent everywhere else. To an outsider, this looked suspiciously unfair. Skill often does. It felt as though the landscape had chosen favorites, and Vikings were not on the list. Violence requires timing. It needs a moment to begin. Here, moments never arrived on schedule. Pressure built without release. Supplies thinned. Camps felt exposed even when nothing happened, especially when nothing happened. Waiting in unfamiliar silence has a way of making imagination work overtime, and imagination has never been kind to tired people. Eventually, a realization settled in. Not all at once. Quietly. This was not a place that rewarded persistence. Staying longer did not improve outcomes. It only increased exhaustion. And exhaustion is the one thing even enthusiastic warriors eventually respect. Courage does not refill empty stomachs or dry, wet clothing. Confidence does not navigate featureless snow. So adjustments were made, routes bent slightly, plans shortened, visits became careful. Nobody stood up and declared a lesson learned. That would have required admitting something uncomfortable. Instead, behavior changed. Ships went elsewhere. Expeditions found better uses for their time. Stories became vague. Details faded. Silence did the work that speeches never could. This was not defeat. It was calculation. Vikings understood value very well. They knew when effort stopped making sense. Raiding was supposed to be efficient. You arrived unexpectedly. You left richer. When that equation failed, the solution was not to push harder. It was to stop wasting energy. What unsettled them most was not danger but refusal. The refusal of the land to behave. The refusal of the situation to offer a clear target. The refusal of experience to turn into glory. These were problems that could not be solved with louder voices or sharper blades. They required something less celebrated. restraint. History often remembers conquerors and battles because those are easy to narrate. It forgets the moments when powerful groups quietly chose not to continue. Those decisions leave fewer marks, no monuments, no heroic last stands, just an absence where ambition once pointed. Late at night, history sounds different. It is less interested in victories and more interested in habits, the places people stopped visiting, the routes they no longer took, the confidence that learned where to end. When the map stopped agreeing with the Vikings, they did not tear it up, they simply stopped trusting it. And sometimes that is the most honest response history records. When the map stopped agreeing with you, the next problem arrived quietly. It did not announce itself as danger. It did not rush forward or shout insults across a field. It simply refused to stay where it was supposed to be. For a culture accustomed to problems that politely presented themselves for solving, this was deeply irritating. Vikings were efficient in their expectations. You landed. Someone noticed, something happened. Villages reacted. Defenses appeared. Fear became visible. Even resistance had a rhythm. You could hear it, you could measure it. Violence followed rules, even when it pretended not to. The world might be hostile, but at least it participated. Silence broke that arrangement. Too much quiet felt wrong. When nothing moved, nothing reacted, and nothing offered itself as a target, effort began to feel misallocated. You could swing an axe only so many times before wondering who exactly you were supposed to be impressing. Bravery requires an audience, or at least an opponent who acknowledges the performance. In unfamiliar northern lands, that acknowledgement never arrived. Ships waited uselessly along the coast, while men walked inland carrying weight that suddenly felt unnecessary. Sound traveled poorly. Voices vanished into trees. Footsteps felt louder than they should, which made every pause feel exposed. Snow softened noise until even a group felt solitary. It was an odd sensation for people who preferred their presence to be obvious. Armor was built for confidence. It announced strength before it was used. Here, it announced inconvenience. Metal caught branches. Shields turned sideways when they should not. Movement slowed into something careful and resentful. The equipment had not changed. The environment had simply decided not to accommodate it. The real discomfort came from timing. Conflict did not begin when expected. It did not rise toward a clear moment of action. Instead, it hovered. Men waited. Nothing happened. Then something happened briefly and without warning. A man stopped moving. Supplies went missing. Camps felt watched without any evidence worth pointing at. Nothing dramatic enough to justify anger, just enough to keep everyone awake. This was not fear in the heroic sense. No one ran, no one panicked. Panic would have implied clarity. This was irritation mixed with exhaustion, the sense that effort was being spent without return. Vikings understood cost very well. They tolerated danger if danger paid. Here danger felt vague, and profit felt theoretical. The people who lived in these places did not offer reassurance. They moved without hurry. They appeared briefly and then did not. They knew where to step. They knew where not to. They did not raise voices. They did not stand still long enough to be counted. To outsiders, this felt less like strategy and more like unfair familiarity with the terrain. Unfairness is unsettling because it suggests the rules were never shared. Vikings were used to learning rules by testing them loudly. Here, testing produced nothing helpful, Charging forward solved nothing. Standing still solved nothing. Shouting into trees produced echoes that felt mocking rather than informative. Over time, something shifted, not in speeches or decisions, in posture. Marches shortened, routes bent. Expeditions ended earlier than planned. No one explained it out loud. Explanation would have required admitting that the problem could not be solved through force. Instead, experience handled it quietly. Stories returned home thinner than usual. Details were missing. Achievements were vague. Losses were discussed indirectly. Men avoided questions. They changed subjects. They described land rather than encounters, weather rather than enemies. Silence filled gaps that boasting normally occupied. That silence mattered. In a culture that narrated everything, refusal to narrate was a signal. Younger men noticed. Leaders adjusted without comment. Maps were not erased. They simply stopped being used in certain directions. Habit replaced ambition. This was not retreat as drama. It was retreat as routine, the kind that never gets a name. Ships sailed elsewhere. Targets shifted. No one declared victory or defeat. They simply stopped trying. For a society that valued action, inaction carried unusual weight. Late-night history prefers these moments, the ones without spectacle, the decisions made by tired people who realized that strength was not the missing ingredient, that sometimes the environment itself was the opponent. And environments do not respond to intimidation. The enemy that refused to stand still was not a person in the way Vikings preferred to recognize. It was a situation, a landscape that dissolved advantage, a rhythm that never aligned with expectations, a refusal to participate in familiar conflict. Bravery depends on clarity. You need to know what bravery looks like in the moment, when to stand, when to rush, when to strike. Here bravery had no shape. Courage could not attach itself to anything solid. It drifted. It became restless. Eventually it grew tired. Efficiency replaced pride. Vikings were practical even when loud about it. They understood that effort without outcome was waste. Waste was unacceptable. Better to seek places where confidence translated into results, where noise produced reaction, where victory came with objects you could carry home. So they left, not dramatically, not angrily, quietly, the kind of leaving that leaves fewer traces than staying would have. The land remained unchanged. The people who knew it continued to move through it, as they always had. The absence of conflict became its own boundary. When the map stops agreeing with you, it does not tear itself apart. It waits. It lets you realize that agreement was never guaranteed. And in that realization, plans soften, routes fade, ambition learns where not to insist. History remembers conquest because conquest leaves debris. It forgets restraint because restraint leaves space. But space is its own record. The empty stretches where stories thin out, the directions no one brags about, the silence that settles where confidence once pointed. Late at night, that silence speaks clearly. It says that not every problem is impressed by strength. Some simply wait for you to decide that your time is better spent elsewhere. After the enemy refused to stand still, something else became impossible to ignore. The land itself began to participate, not loudly, not dramatically. It did not rise up or strike back. It simply stopped being helpful. For people who relied on cooperation from terrain as much as from fear, this was an unexpected betrayal. On open ground, strength feels elegant. Movement is wide. Noise travels cleanly. Distance behaves predictably. Armor announces presence and intention. Shields face forward. Axes swing with confidence. Every step reinforces the idea that momentum is on your side. This is where reputation thrives. This is where stories are born. Then the forest closes in. Trees stand closer than expected. Branches reach at metal like curious hands. Snow softens edges and swallows sound. Suddenly nothing carries. Orders do not travel. Footsteps sound too loud and then disappear entirely. You can be surrounded by people and still feel isolated. The group exists but does not cohere. Density without connection is an unsettling thing. Armor begins to complain, not loudly, just enough to be noticed. Weight shifts awkwardly. Movement slows. Every step costs more than it should. Equipment designed for dominance begins to feel like a negotiation. Shields bump trunks. Spears catch on branches. Axes want space and find none. Strength is still present, but it is no longer efficient. Efficiency matters more than power once exhaustion arrives. The forest does not rush, it waits. It lets you move deeper before reminding you that direction is optional. Landmarks disappear under snow. Tracks fade overnight. What looked solid betrays weight. What looked familiar rearranges itself quietly. The ground refuses to confirm where you are. Orientation becomes a habit rather than a certainty. Sound behaves strangely here. Snow absorbs it. Trees scatter it. Voices flatten and vanish. Shouted orders turn into awkward gestures. Silence stretches longer than expected. When something finally breaks that silence, it feels intrusive rather than informative. A snapped branch does not clarify anything. It only raises suspicion. Being watched without evidence creates a particular discomfort. You feel observed but cannot prove it. There is no one to confront, no shape to charge. The instinct to respond has nowhere to go. Restlessness replaces action. Vigilance replaces momentum. Fatigue follows, close behind. The forest also has a sense of humor, not the friendly kind, the quiet kind. It allows movement just enough to encourage persistence. Then it makes every correction costly. Step too fast and sweat forms. Sweat freezes. Clothing turns against you. Metal grows colder. Warmth becomes something you negotiate rather than assume. Cold here is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as danger. It punishes small mistakes immediately. A wet boot, an exposed hand, a pause too long. The body notices before the mind finishes thinking. This kind of cold does not care about bravery. It responds only to preparation and familiarity. Neither arrives quickly for visitors. Navigation at sea rewards confidence. Navigation here punishes it. You cannot see far enough to plan boldly. You move from moment to moment. Each decision feels provisional. Direction stops being a line and becomes a suggestion. Confidence starts to feel like optimism rather than strategy. Those who belong to this land move differently. They step where snow holds. They know which ground lies. Their pace matches the terrain rather than fighting it. They do not waste energy announcing themselves. They do not hurry because hurry solves nothing here. To outsiders, this looks like favoritism, as if the land itself has preferences. Favoritism is unsettling because it implies exclusion, not hostility, indifference. The land does not resist visitors. It simply does not assist them. It offers no shortcuts, no allowances, no admiration. Strength is acknowledged only to the extent that it fits between the trees. The forest also refuses spectacle. There are no wide clearings for dramatic confrontation, no obvious stages. Even conflict, if it happens, feels cramped and unsatisfying. There is no room for formation, no rhythm to follow. Violence becomes awkward rather than glorious. That alone removes much of its appeal. Camps feel temporary in an uncomfortable way. Fires reveal location, smoke lingers, light travels farther than expected, darkness presses close, sleep comes lightly, every sound feels personal. Equipment must be watched constantly. Rest becomes fragmented. The longer you stay, the more everything feels provisional. This environment does not defeat people quickly. It exhausts them slowly. It drains patience rather than blood. Supplies thin. Movement costs more. Morale erodes without a clear cause. Nothing catastrophic happens. Nothing resolves. The lack of resolution becomes the pressure. People who are used to decisive outcomes find this particularly irritating. There is no single moment to endure, no peak to overcome, just accumulation. Fatigue layered on uncertainty, layered on effort that produces nothing visible. That kind of strain is difficult to narrate, harder to justify. Stories brought back from such places lack sharp edges. They describe land rather than achievement, weather rather than conquest, distance rather than victory. Listeners notice what is missing. The absence of detail carries weight. In cultures that value demonstration, silence becomes instruction. Eventually, behavior changes, not because anyone announces a lesson, because experience teaches quietly. Routes bend, plans shorten. Expeditions favor places where effort produces return. No one claims fear, they simply adjust. Adjustment is easier to defend than admission. Late night history lingers here because this is where power meets its limit, not through opposition but through indifference. The forest does not argue, it does not negotiate, it does not escalate. It simply remains itself and waits for visitors to decide how much effort that is worth. When strength learns to feel heavy, something fundamental shifts. Confidence becomes conditional. Reputation loses relevance. What matters is whether the environment participates. If it does not, the wisest response is not persistence, it is restraint. The forest teaches this without words. Snow teaches it overnight. Trees teach it through friction and delay. Cold teaches it through discomfort rather than threat. None of it is dramatic enough to be celebrated. All of it is effective enough to be remembered. By the time people leave, they do not feel defeated. They feel relieved. Relieved to return to spaces where movement makes sense again, where noise produces response, where strength feels light. That relief says more than any battle could. And so the land remains, dense, quiet, patient. It does not chase anyone away. It simply waits for those who mistake endurance for compatibility. When the night grows quiet and the stories thin out, this is where history leaves a pause. Not a warning, not a lesson. Just a space where ambition once tried to push forward and decided it preferred somewhere else. After strength learned to feel heavy, the struggle changed character. It stopped behaving like a contest and began acting like a scheduled problem. Not the dramatic kind with alarms and urgency, but the slow administrative kind, where everything takes longer than planned and nothing finishes cleanly. This was not a war you could point at. and say it happened there. It was a war that happened between steps. At first it barely registered. A supply carrier took longer to return. A camp needed to be moved again. A march covered less ground than expected. None of this justified concern. Small inconveniences are easy to dismiss, especially for people trained to ignore discomfort. Vikings were very good at ignoring discomfort. They wore it proudly. The issue was not pain or danger. It was inefficiency. Attrition is irritating precisely because it refuses drama. No clash of shields, no decisive moment, no clear exchange where someone wins and someone loses. Instead, there is subtraction. One man less here. One tool gone there. Food disappearing faster than it should. Energy spent on problems that do not stay solved. Harassment works best when it does not announce itself. A camp feels unsettled at night. Something has been disturbed. Equipment is not where it was left. Nothing is stolen enough to justify outrage, just enough to require checking everything again. Sleep becomes lighter. Waking becomes slower. Fatigue accumulates quietly. Movement inland magnifies the problem. The deeper you go, the less return you see. Effort increases, reward thins. The calculation shifts in uncomfortable ways. Every step forward feels like an investment that produces no interest. Only maintenance, only cost, only another decision to make tomorrow. There is no obvious target to retaliate against. Charging achieves nothing. Waiting achieves nothing. Shouting into the trees feels childish after the first attempt. Violence without a recipient loses its meaning. You cannot intimidate a situation. You cannot threaten an absence. Supply lines stretch thin in places that do not cooperate. Carrying food becomes a job rather than a background assumption. What used to be automatic now demands planning. Planning slows everything else. Momentum fades. When momentum fades, morale begins to look for something to blame. But blame needs an object. Here there is none. The land does not explain itself. The people who know it do not volunteer clarity. Every response feels delayed. Every reaction feels late. You are always responding to what already happened rather than shaping what comes next. Attrition does not demand bravery. It demands patience. And patience is not a quality that receives much praise in warrior cultures. Patience looks like hesitation from the outside. It looks like uncertainty. It looks like waiting. None of these make for good stories. The worst part is that attrition feels wasteful, not tragic. Wasteful. Time is spent. Energy is burned. Nothing changes. A man who falls in a fight at least resolves something. A man who limps back exhausted resolves nothing. He simply adds weight to the return journey. As days pass, small decisions multiply. Do we push further? Do we stop early? Do we conserve supplies or move faster? Every option costs something. None promise satisfaction. The mind grows tired of choosing between bad and slightly worse. The land assists attrition by offering no finish line. There is no point where persistence suddenly pays off. No clearing where effort is rewarded. You keep going because stopping feels premature. You stop because continuing feels foolish. Neither option feels heroic. This kind of pressure changes behavior. Camps become quieter. Movement becomes cautious. Conversations shorten. People watch one another more closely, not out of suspicion, but fatigue. Everyone is waiting for someone else to explain why this is still happening. Stories brought home from such journeys feel thin. They contain more about weather and distance than about achievement. Listeners notice the absence of triumph. They ask fewer questions. The questions they do ask receive vague answers. Vague answers are powerful. They spread caution without instruction. Younger men absorb it without being told. Leaders adjust routes without announcing policy. Habit becomes a map drawn in experience rather than ink. Attrition leaves no monuments. It leaves no scars worth pointing at. What it leaves is absence. Routes not taken, places not revisited, plans quietly revised. This is how influence works when it does not seek attention. Late-night history appreciates this because it understands that most decisions are not made in moments of courage but in moments of tired calculation. When people realize that the cost is no longer worth the story they might tell later, the environment does not need to win. It only needs to make participation expensive. Once effort outweighs reward, the conclusion arrives on its own. No speech is required, no defeat declared, just a collective sense that time could be better spent elsewhere. Attrition also humbles reputation. A feared name means little when there is nothing to fear back. Noise loses value when silence controls the pace. Numbers lose relevance when movement itself is the problem. The irony is gentle but persistent. A culture that valued direct confrontation found itself eroded by indirect pressure, not through clever trickery, through refusal to cooperate, through patience, through the simple act of remaining inconvenient. Eventually, the calculation becomes obvious. There are places where effort produces return, and there are places where effort produces only more effort. Wisdom lies in telling the difference. Pride resists that distinction. Experience enforces it. So people leave, not in defeat, in relief. Relief to return to spaces where action feels productive again, where exertion produces visible results, where the end of a day feels like progress rather than survival. The war that never offered a climax ends this way. Not with cheers or mourning, with quiet acceptance, the kind that settles in routines, the kind that redraws borders without saying so, the kind that turns uncertainty into habit. When night falls and history slows its voice, this is where it lingers, on the wars that taught nothing loudly, on the conflicts that never concluded because they never properly began, on the long, tired realization that not every place is impressed by effort. Attrition does not chase anyone away. It simply waits. And eventually everyone decides they have somewhere else to be. After the war that never offered a climax, something subtle settled into place. Not a treaty, not a boundary drawn on parchment, just behavior, the kind that does not ask permission and does not bother explaining itself. People began to move differently, not dramatically, not nervously, simply with less enthusiasm and more attention. Cultures that value noise usually do not admit when silence becomes useful. They prefer to believe quiet is a choice rather than a necessity. But habits tell the truth long before words do. Ships still sailed, men still traveled, yet routes curved, stops shortened, voices lowered without instruction. This was not strategy in the formal sense. It was adjustment learned through repetition. Passing through certain regions acquired an etiquette that no one ever stood up to teach. You did not arrive loudly, you did not linger, you did not wander. If you needed to move through, you followed someone who already knew how. If you did not know how, you learned quickly or you left earlier than planned. These were not rules carved into wood or stone. They were rules carved into memory. Guides became valuable in a way weapons could not match, not because they fought better, but because they prevented effort from being wasted. They knew where ground held weight. They knew which paths disappeared overnight. They knew when to stop moving, even if daylight suggested otherwise. This knowledge did not announce itself as authority. It simply worked. Working quietly became a skill, moving without unnecessary sound, touching less, caring only what mattered, the kind of restraint that feels unnatural to people used to making their presence obvious. It required a different posture, less forward lean, more listening. Even the confident learned to watch their footing before trusting it. Staying short became another rule, not because staying longer was impossible, but because staying longer rarely improved outcomes. Time spent did not translate into advantage. It translated into fatigue, into supplies thinning, into attention fraying. Leaving early stopped feeling like caution and started feeling like competence. This shift did not come with pride attached. No one boasted about knowing when to leave. They simply did it. Bragging requires an audience willing to admire the choice. Here, admiration was scarce. Survival was adequate praise. When a culture known for loud arrival learns to pass through quietly, something fundamental has changed. Not belief, behavior. And behavior is harder to argue with. It is shaped by consequence rather than opinion. These quiet rules spread without needing explanation. Someone traveled and returned without trouble. Someone else followed the same pattern and noticed the same result. Soon, deviation felt unnecessary. Why announce yourself if nothing was gained by being noticed? Why linger if nothing improved by staying? Silence became practical, not respectful. Practical. Loudness invited attention, attention invited delay, delay invited cost. None of this was dramatic enough to be feared. It was annoying enough to be avoided. There is a gentle irony here. A culture that valued courage measured in volume discovered that restraint delivered better results. Not because restraint was admired, but because it reduced friction. And friction was the real enemy. The land did not demand obedience. It simply responded better to those who did not insist on being impressive. It rewarded familiarity over force, precision over presence. Those who adapted did not become weaker. They became less wasteful. Late-night history enjoys these moments because they reveal how power actually shifts, not through conquest or collapse, but through habit, through the slow learning of what works and what does not, through the quiet abandonment of behaviors that once felt essential. No council announced these rules. No leader claimed authorship. That would have required admitting why the rules were needed. Instead, they spread sideways, from one journey to the next, from one tired return to another. Maps did not change, words did not change, only movement did. Certain paths were taken with care, certain pauses shortened, certain nights ended earlier than planned. This is how boundaries form without being declared. When newcomers ignored these patterns, they learned quickly why the patterns existed, not through punishment, but through inconvenience, through wasted effort. Through the same slow irritation others had already decided was not worth repeating. Those who listened moved more easily. Those who did not listen eventually. Experience is persuasive when it repeats itself. The humor here is quiet but persistent. Loud cultures rarely notice when they become quieter. They prefer to believe they are choosing discretion rather than being taught it. The distinction hardly matters. The result is the same. This was not respect in the ceremonial sense. It was acknowledgement in the practical sense. The acknowledgement that some places respond poorly to force, and well to familiarity. That some situations improve only when left alone. Passing through became an act of cooperation rather than domination. Cooperation not with people necessarily, but with conditions, weather, terrain, timing, the small, unglamorous factors that decide outcomes while being ignored in speeches. Staying short protected morale as much as resources. Fatigue breeds doubt. Doubt breeds frustration. Frustration breeds mistakes. Leaving before that sequence completed felt wise rather than cautious. Over time, these quiet rules hardened into instinct. You did not need to think about them. You felt them. A pause lasted shorter. A voice dropped lower. A camp broke earlier in the morning. Nobody explained why. Everyone understood. This understanding never appeared in official stories. Stories prefer conflict and resolution. This had neither. It had process, it had adjustment, it had acceptance without ceremony. Late-night history prefers this kind of learning, the kind that arrives without applause, the kind that settles into muscle memory rather than ideology. When people stop insisting on being seen and start prioritizing being done, eventually the region acquired a reputation not for danger, but for inconvenience. And inconvenience is a powerful deterrent. It does not inspire defiance. It inspires rerouting. The most lasting victories are often the ones no one claims, where nothing is destroyed, where no one is chased away, where effort simply moves elsewhere. When a culture that thrives on noise learns to move quietly and leave early, it has encountered something it cannot outshout. It has learned that sometimes survival depends not on how loudly you arrive, but on how lightly you pass through. These rules remain because they do not need enforcement. They work, and when rules work, people keep them, even when they never admit they learned them at all. So the war that never offered a climax dissolves into routine, into softened steps, into shortened stays, into voices lowered not from fear, but from experience. History does not mark this moment with ink, it marks it with absence. And absence, late at night, tells its own story. After the quiet rules no one announced settled into place, leaving stopped feeling like a decision. It became something closer to routine. Not an act of fear or defeat, but a small practical choice repeated often enough to lose its drama. People did not gather to discuss it. They did not weigh options aloud. They simply found themselves turning back, earlier than before, and feeling satisfied with that outcome. This is how retreat actually works in history, rarely with speeches, rarely with declarations, more often through repetition. One journey ends a little sooner, another avoids a familiar route, a third never begins at all. No single moment carries meaning, but together they form a pattern strong enough to replace ambition. The first sign is usually efficiency. People begin to notice that nothing valuable comes from pushing further. Time spent does not produce stories worth telling. Effort produces fatigue rather than advantage. Supplies shrink without reward. The arithmetic becomes difficult to defend, even to oneself. When calculation replaces enthusiasm, behavior changes quickly. It is not that danger disappears. Danger is manageable. It can be planned for. What disappears is return. There are places where risk produces outcome and places where it produces only more risk. Once that difference becomes obvious, stubbornness looks less like bravery and more like poor judgment. Routes bend without explanation. Maps remain unchanged, but feet choose differently. Travelers take paths that feel lighter even if they are longer. Camps break earlier. Voices grow quieter. None of this is announced as policy. It is simply more comfortable. Stories told afterward reflect the shift. They become shorter, less detailed. Focus drifts from action to weather, from encounters to distance. Listeners hear what is missing. They understand without being told. Silence fills the gaps more effectively than warning ever could. This is where irony appears gently. Cultures that pride themselves on decisiveness often believe they choose their actions freely. In reality, habit chooses for them. Once leaving early proves useful, it repeats itself. Once avoidance saves effort, it becomes wisdom. Pride adjusts quietly to survive. No one wants to be the first to admit something is not worth the trouble. That admission carries too much weight. But being the 10th person to behave as if it is not worth the trouble feels reasonable. Consensus forms without meeting. Agreement arrives without signatures. The land does not change. It does not need to. What changes is the expectation brought to it. People stop assuming that presence must produce outcome. They stop expecting the environment to cooperate simply because they arrived prepared. This adjustment reduces frustration immediately. Late-night history finds comfort here because this is where human behavior looks most honest. No heroes, no villains, just tired people making sensible choices and refusing to decorate them with meaning. The absence of drama is the point. Habitual retreat leaves few marks. No burned ground, no ruined walls, just empty spaces where activity once concentrated. These absences are difficult to study and easy to ignore. They do not announce themselves. They simply persist. Over time, the region acquires a reputation that feels vague but firm. Not dangerous, not forbidden, simply inconvenient. Inconvenience is powerful because it does not challenge identity. It does not demand courage or defiance. It invites rerouting. When people stop going somewhere, that place does not need defense. It does not need intimidation. It does not need explanation. It becomes protected by indifference. Indifference is remarkably durable. The quiet humor lies in how quickly this becomes normalized. What once felt like an ambitious frontier becomes an afterthought. People speak of it less. When they do, they speak without enthusiasm. The tone discourages curiosity more effectively than warnings ever could. Newcomers sometimes ignore this tone. They arrive with energy and expectation. They push forward out of principle or optimism. They return with fewer words. Soon their behavior aligns with everyone else. Experience repeats its lesson patiently. Leaving becomes efficient. Efficient behavior spreads. It is copied without praise. It requires no justification. It saves time and energy. These are convincing arguments in any era. Eventually, no one remembers exactly when the shift happened. They only remember that certain routes are no longer taken. Certain plans are no longer proposed. The absence of challenge feels natural, as if it has always been this way. This is how power recedes without confrontation, not because it is challenged, but because it is not rewarded. Effort moves toward places that respond. Attention follows opportunity. What remains quiet is not conquered. It is simply bypassed. Late-night history lingers on these moments because they reveal something uncomfortable. Strength does not always lose to strength. Sometimes it loses to arithmetic. Sometimes it loses to boredom. Sometimes it loses to the realization that nothing interesting happens if you continue. There is no shame here, only adjustment. Adjustment is rarely celebrated. Yet it sustains far more societies than heroism ever has. People survive by noticing what drains them and choosing otherwise. When leaving becomes a habit, the story ends without ending. No conclusion is written, no lesson is declared. Life simply flows around an obstacle rather than through it. Water does this instinctively. Humans learn it slowly. In the quiet hours, this kind of ending feels appropriate. History lowers its voice. It does not insist on meaning. It allows patterns to speak for themselves. The retreat that happens by habit rather than proclamation leaves no echo, but it shapes the landscape of action more permanently than any shouted command. Silence completes the work that noise never could, and so the roots change. The stories thin. The effort goes elsewhere. Nothing is defeated. Nothing is claimed. Yet something essential is decided. Sometimes the most lasting choice is not to continue, and sometimes the most powerful response is simply not to return. Night does not arrive loudly in Edo. It seeps in. The sky dims. The air cools just enough to remind everyone that the day is finished with them. Doors slide shut, lamps appear, and somewhere beneath the low roofs of the city, charcoal begins to glow. Not in kitchens, not inside homes, but out on the streets where hunger has learned to wait patiently. The first lanterns rise without ceremony. They are not announcements. They are invitations. A soft light appears at the corner of a bridge. Another flickers near a ferry landing. Rain darkens the packed earth streets, turning footsteps into quiet splashes. The smell arrives before the sound. Smoke mixed with soy and fish oil drifts outward and does what no bell or proclamation could ever do. It gathers people. Edo does not need advertising at night. It only needs bodies that have worked all day and weather damp enough to make warmth feel urgent. Hunger sharpens quickly when clothes are wet, and the wind creeps under thin sleeves. A bowl of something hot becomes less of a preference and more of a plan. The streets begin to change character. What was a route becomes a pause. What was a passage becomes a place. Vendors appear as if they were waiting for the light to be right. Some push small carts. Others balance poles across their shoulders, with pots swinging gently at each end. Steam rises and disappears into rain. The city exhales. Eating here does not involve sitting. Sitting would take too long. Sitting would require space that does not exist. Food is handed over quickly and eaten where you stand, under an eave, beside a railing, half turned away from the street so passing bodies do not collide with bowls. This is not a failure of manners. It is an adaptation. A bowl is held with both hands, not out of reverence but practicality. Fingers warm against ceramic. Broth warms the chest. Steam fogs the face. For a few minutes, the rain becomes background. The city continues moving around you without concern. This kind of eating flattens difference. A laborer stands beside a messenger. A traveler shares the same thin space as someone who knows every street by heart. Even those who prefer not to be seen here still arrive. They stand a little apart. They keep their posture controlled. They eat quickly and leave without comment. Hunger does not ask questions about rank. Coins change hands with little conversation. The exchange is practiced, efficient. Bowls are returned, wiped, passed on. No one lingers to praise the food. Praise would slow the line. Satisfaction is shown by empty bowls and quick departures. The rain helps. It softens the city. It lowers expectations. On wet nights, fires feel safer. Smoke behaves better. Inspectors are less eager to patrol streets slick with mud. Vendors know this. They appear in greater numbers when the weather discourages everyone else. Lantern light reflects in puddles, stretching the street into something longer and brighter than it is by day. The night market is not a single place. It is a pattern, a loose network of warmth stitched across the city by hunger and habit. Food here is not decorative. It does not perform. It solves a problem. Thin noodles dropped into broth, fish skewered and held over charcoal, dumplings brushed with sauce and turned slowly until heat does its quiet work. Nothing requires explanation. Everything is designed to be eaten quickly and remembered only as warmth. The smell of eel cuts through everything else. It is richer, heavier. It slows people down despite themselves. Fat drips into coals and sends up smoke that demands attention. This is indulgence by Edo standards. Not excessive, just noticeable. People pause longer here. They chew carefully. They accept sticky fingers without complaint. Rain hisses on charcoal. Lanterns sway slightly. Someone laughs briefly and then stops. Not because joy is forbidden, but because joy is unnecessary. The food does enough. Street sweets appear later. Their fires are smaller. Their smells quieter. Rice dumplings warming slowly. Sweet paste tucked inside simple dough. These are not celebrations. They are comforts. Something gentle to follow smoke and salt. Children tug sleeves. Adults share without ceremony. No one counts portions. Eating outside like this requires tolerance for crowds, for noise, for closeness. Sleeves brush. Elbows negotiate space. Everyone understands the rules without speaking them. Eat quickly. Do not block movement. Step aside when finished. The street becomes a dining room that belongs to no one. It is borrowed briefly by everyone, then returned exactly as it was. No tables, no chairs, no trace left behind, except damp footprints and the memory of smoke clinging to wood. This impermanence is essential. Edo is a city afraid of fire. Wooden buildings packed tightly together do not forgive carelessness. Vendors keep flames small, charcoal over open fire, everything ready to disappear if needed. A shout, a glance, and the street empties as if nothing had been there. The night market survives because it knows how to vanish. It feeds the city without claiming it. It appears when hunger is loudest and leaves before daylight asks questions. By the time the rain lightens and the crowds thin, vendors begin packing with the calm of repetition. Pots empty, lanterns lower, shoulder poles lift once more. Lighter now. Carts roll away toward narrow homes and storage sheds. The city absorbs the absence easily. Streets return to their daytime roles. Orderly, wet, unremarkable. Only the smell lingers faintly, trapped in wood and fabric. For those who ate, the meal lasts longer than the stall. Warmth remains in the stomach. Fingers stay scented with smoke. Memory holds a specific corner, a particular bridge, a moment under an eave when rain stopped mattering. Edo does not remember these nights as events. They are too common for that, too ordinary. That is their strength. Night food does not seek to be remembered. It seeks to be useful. Late at night, history pays attention to these moments. Not because they are dramatic, but because they reveal how cities actually function. Not through declarations or design, but through repetition. Through small solutions, applied thousands of times until they become invisible. Lanterns rise. Charcoal glows. People eat, standing in the rain. The city continues. And by morning, it is as if nothing happened at all. The rain has already decided the mood of the evening. It is not dramatic rain. It does not flood or threaten. It simply refuses to stop. The kind that soaks sleeves, darkens wood, and convinces everyone that standing still indoors would be a mistake. This is when the noodle vendors begin to matter. They do not announce themselves with banners or signs. They use voices instead. Long calls stretched across wet streets, rising and falling with practiced patience. The sound is not urgent. It does not beg. It assumes hunger is already present and only needs direction. People hear it and adjust their walking without thinking. A cart appears near a bridge where footsteps slow naturally. A shoulder pole pauses under an eave. Steam lifts into the rain and disappears almost immediately, which somehow makes it feel warmer. The vendor stops. A customer stops. Coins are exchanged without negotiation. Everything after that happens quickly. The bowl is ready before anyone has time to consider sitting down. Sitting would require furniture. Furniture would require space. Space is not part of the agreement here. The agreement is simple. Heat now. Movement later. Thin noodles drop into broth that has been waiting all evening to be useful. Soy and fish scent rise together in a way that feels familiar, even to people passing through for the first time. The bowl is handed over with both hands, not ceremoniously, but because it is hot and both hands are practical. Eating begins immediately. There is no polite delay. Steam fogs faces. Sleeves are pushed back. Someone turns slightly toward the wall to avoid traffic. The street does not pause. It flows around the act of eating without acknowledgement. This food is not designed to impress. It is designed to solve a problem efficiently. Cold and hunger arrive together on nights like this. The noodles answer both without comment. The broth is simple, the portion is modest. The effect is immediate. People eat standing because standing is faster. Faster means less exposure to rain. Faster means less time blocking others. Faster means the vendor can serve the next person without tension. Speed here is not rudeness. It is courtesy. The rhythm repeats itself over and over. Call, stop, pay, eat, return the bowl, move on. Each step fits neatly into the next. There is no room for improvisation and none is required. The routine has been refined by thousands of evenings exactly like this one. What makes this moment remarkable is not the food itself, but the way it equalizes everyone who reaches for a bowl. A laborer still damp from work stands beside a courier who has been running routes since dusk. A traveler unfamiliar with the city eats beside someone who could navigate these streets blind. No one looks at anyone else for long. There is no need. Rank does not disappear, but it loosens. The bowl does not care who holds it. The broth does not adjust its temperature based on status. Everyone burns their tongue the same way if they hurry. Everyone warms their hands the same way if they do not. Even those who prefer dignity over convenience find themselves here eventually. They choose corners. They angle their bodies carefully. They eat quickly and without expression. The noodles do not judge the performance. They are finished whether the eater wishes to be seen or not. The rain helps enforce this equality. It dampens clothing and expectations alike. No one looks impressive when soaked. No one moves gracefully on slick ground. The city feels flatter on nights like this, more human, less interested in ceremony. The vendor does not linger either. There is no conversation beyond what is necessary, no commentary on taste, no expectation of gratitude. Satisfaction is measured by empty bowls returned promptly. Compliments would slow the line. Silence keeps it moving. This is what efficiency looks like when it has learned manners. Nothing is wasted, not time, not heat, not motion. Even the smoke is minimal, kept low and controlled. Charcoal burns steadily. Pots are small enough to manage easily and large enough to matter. The city tolerates this because it leaves no scars. Fires are small. Setups are light. Everything can vanish in moments if required. A glance down the street is enough warning. The vendor knows when to pack. The street knows how to forget. Eating like this trains the body differently. You learn to balance a bowl in one hand and chopsticks in the other. You learn to step aside when finished without being told. You learn how long you can stand in one place before becoming an obstacle. This learning is unspoken. Children pick it up by watching adults. Travelers absorb it by necessity. No one explains it because explanation would slow things down. The street teaches through repetition. There is a quiet humor in how serious this all feels without ever pretending to be important. No one writes poems about eating noodles in the rain. No one builds monuments to these moments. And yet they happen every night because they work. The noodles are not comfort food in the sentimental sense. They do not promise memory or nostalgia. They promise warmth. They deliver it quickly. Anything more would be inefficient. As bowls are emptied and returned, the vendor wipes them clean with practiced motions. The pole shifts back onto the shoulder. The call resumes. Another cluster forms a few steps down the street. The same routine unfolds again. People who have eaten move on with noticeably better posture. Shoulders drop slightly, hands stop shaking, breath steadies. The city receives them back without comment. Hunger has been addressed. That is enough. Late-night history prefers these moments because they show how urban life actually sustains itself, not through grand meals or formal dining, but through small, hot solutions, delivered repeatedly and without drama. Cities survive on these quiet efficiencies. When the rain finally eases and the crowds thin, the noodle vendors will disappear as smoothly as they arrived. By morning, there will be no sign they were ever there. No tables, no ash piles. Only the faint scent of broth, caught in the wood of nearby buildings. For those who stood and ate, the memory will linger just long enough to make the next wet evening feel manageable. That is the full extent of the promise. The city does not thank them. It does not need to. It simply continues, warmed briefly, fed efficiently, and ready to do the same thing again tomorrow night if the rain decides to return. After bowls that never asked you to sit had done their quiet work, the street did not empty. Hunger had softened, not vanished. Warmth had arrived, but something richer still hovered in the rain. This was the moment when walking slowed for reasons no one announced. The smell arrived first. It did not rush. It drifted low and steady, thick enough to interrupt thought. Fat meeting charcoal produces a particular honesty. There is no subtlety to it. It speaks directly to the body and asks very little of the mind. In Edo on wet nights, that smell belonged to eel. People noticed themselves slowing before they admitted why. Feet hesitated, necks turned. Someone who had planned to pass through found themselves standing still without having made a decision. The rain continued falling. Lantern light wavered, and the street accepted the pause without comment. Eel was not the cheapest thing you could eat outside. That was part of its appeal. It sat just far enough above necessity to feel like a choice. Not a reckless one, a sensible indulgence. The kind you justify by telling yourself that long days deserve small rewards. The vendor worked with practiced efficiency. Live eels were kept nearby, calm in a way that suggested familiarity with this ending. Cleaning was quick. Skewers appeared. The grill hissed softly as flesh met heat. Fat dripped down and struck charcoal, releasing smoke that cut through rain and conversation alike. This was not food meant to be hidden. The smell traveled deliberately. It did not apologize. It invited. Even those who had already eaten found themselves reconsidering. Hunger is not the only reason people eat. Sometimes the reason is that stopping feels better than continuing. The glaze was simple and applied repeatedly, soy and sweetness layered carefully until the surface darkened and shone. There was no rush here. Unlike noodles, eel did not reward speed. It asked for patience. Just a little, enough to slow the evening. People stood longer at these stalls, not long enough to block the street, just long enough to feel the heat on their faces and watch the careful turning of skewers. Chewing began more slowly. Bites were smaller. Attention narrowed to texture and warmth. Everyone ate the same thing. That was part of the quiet comedy. The city was rigid about rank in daylight. At night, under rain and lanterns, a skewer of eel flattened distinctions with surprising efficiency. A merchant stood beside a porter, a traveler beside someone who had never left their district. Even those who valued composure found it difficult to chew without expression. Some attempted dignity. They held the skewer carefully. They avoided eye contact. They chewed with restraint. The eel did not cooperate with that effort. Fat dripped. Fingers grew sticky. Sleeves were sacrificed without ceremony. The street accepted this as normal. Eel carried a reputation beyond taste. It was believed to restore energy, especially in summer, when heat pressed down relentlessly. On wet nights, belief mattered less than sensation. The warmth was immediate. The richness lingered. The body responded before the mind finished justifying the expense. Eating this way invited a pause in movement. The street did not object. It flowed around the stillness. People waited their turn. No one complained. No one hurried the vendor. This was understood to be a moment worth allowing. The rain softened everything. Smoke rose thicker. Lantern light reflected off wet stones and turned the street into something briefly intimate. Conversations dropped lower. Laughter appeared and vanished quickly. No one lingered longer than necessary, but no one rushed either. Eel demanded presence. You could not eat it absent-mindedly. It required 2 hands and attention to dripping glaze. It slowed the night by a few breaths. That was its gift. The vendor knew when to move on. Once the crowd thinned, the grill cooled. Skewers were counted. Charcoal was banked. The stall would reappear elsewhere, guided by foot traffic and hunger rather than schedule. Those who had eaten resumed walking with altered pace. Shoulders loosened. Steps steadied. The rain felt less intrusive. The night felt manageable again. Not because anything had changed, but because the body had been persuaded to cooperate. There was a quiet irony in how this worked. A city obsessed with order allowed these small moments of indulgence to flourish in its streets. Not because they were approved, but because they solved problems without causing new ones. Fires stayed small. Stalls stayed light. Nothing permanent was built. Nothing needed to be defended. Eel stalls did not announce permanence. They did not claim territory. They appeared where people slowed and vanished where they did not. The street remembered them only as warmth. Late night history pays attention here because this is where luxury behaves responsibly, not hidden behind doors, not elevated above daily life, just present enough to matter and modest enough to disappear. There is no performance in this indulgence, no ceremony, no seating. You eat standing, rain tapping your shoulders, smoke curling past your face. The experience is shared without conversation. Everyone understands why they stopped. This kind of eating teaches the city how to pause without stopping entirely. Movement resumes smoothly. The flow continues. Nothing is disrupted. For a moment, pleasure fits neatly into routine. By the time the rain eases or the night deepens, the eel stalls will be gone. The street will return to noodles and footsteps. The richer smoke will fade. Only the memory of slowed walking will remain. People will not speak of it later. They will not describe the taste in detail. They will only remember that on a wet night, the street offered something worth stopping for. That is enough. In Edo, luxury did not need a room or a chair. Sometimes it arrived on a stick, eaten under a lantern, with rain falling steadily and no one asking you to sit. After the smoke that made people stop walking had thinned and drifted away, the street did not rush back into motion. Something softer took its place. Not silence, not hunger. A pause that felt earned, the kind that arrives when effort has been acknowledged and the body is willing to listen again. This was when the sweet stalls mattered. They did not compete with smoke or noise. They avoided it. Their fires were smaller. Their scents stayed close to the pot. Where eel demanded attention and noodles demanded speed, sweets asked almost nothing at all. Just a few minutes, just a little patience. A pot of red bean paste warmed slowly beneath a cloth. Rice cakes rested nearby, pale and unassuming, waiting to be brushed or dipped. Nothing sizzled, nothing dripped. Steam rose gently and stayed low, as if careful not to disturb the night. People approached these stalls differently. They did not stop abruptly. They drifted closer. Steps shortened. Conversations faded without ending. Someone who had already eaten found room for this without explanation. Sweetness does not require justification. It simply follows effort. The vendor moved slowly on purpose. There was no advantage in speed here. The rice needed time, the paste needed warmth rather than heat. Hands worked deliberately, almost lazily, in contrast to the rest of the street. This was not inefficiency. It was design. A small portion was handed over, light enough to hold easily, warm enough to notice, sweet enough to soften the mouth rather than overwhelm it. People ate carefully, not because it demanded care, but because there was no reason to hurry. Children appeared more often near these stalls. They waited without fidgeting. Adults stood nearby and did not rush them. The city tolerated this pause easily. Sweets created a different rhythm, one that allowed standing still without feeling in the way. The rain felt quieter here. Lantern light reflected more gently off damp wood. The street seemed to lower its voice. No one laughed loudly. No one shouted. Even the vendors called less. Sweetness carried its own invitation. This was the moment when the city forgave itself for the day. A city rigid with rules and routines allowed itself this softness without announcing permission. It did not last long. It did not need to. A few minutes were enough. Eating something sweet after smoke and salt changed the body's posture. Shoulders dropped, breathing slowed. The night felt less demanding, not because work was finished, but because it no longer pressed as hard. There was a quiet irony in how modest this indulgence was. No chairs, no plates worth washing, no lingering. The sweetness was not meant to impress. It was meant to ease the edges left by heat and hurry. People shared pieces without discussion. A bite passed from hand to hand. No one counted. No one claimed ownership. This was not generosity as performance. It was convenience shaped into kindness. The vendor watched without comment. Sweet stalls did not invite conversation. They invited calm. Coins were accepted quietly. Wrappings were folded neatly. Everything suggested that this moment would not be remembered loudly. And it was not. These sweets did not produce stories. They produced relief, the kind that settles into the body and disappears by morning, leaving no trace except the sense that the night had been kinder than expected. When the stall packed up, it did so gently, pots covered, cloths folded, lantern dimmed. The street accepted the absence easily. There was nothing to miss because nothing had demanded attention in the first place. Late-night history lingers here because this is how cities survive themselves. Not by constant intensity, but by allowing softness to exist briefly between harder moments. Not as an escape, but as balance. Edo did not abandon its discipline at night. It adjusted it. Smoke for hunger, sweetness for calm, movement for work, standing still for recovery. After sweetness, people moved on. Slowly at first, then with purpose restored. The night continued, the rain continued, the city remained. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly the point. A house in Roman Londinium did not greet you gently. The moment you crossed the threshold, the city followed you inside. Sound slipped through thin walls. Smoke clung to the air. Somewhere nearby, a voice argued about prices while another complained about rain. This was not a retreat from the street. It was the street continuing under a roof. Most homes were narrow and practical. Space was valuable and comfort was negotiable. Buildings pressed close together as if sharing warmth. The front room often opened directly onto the road and doubled as a workshop or shop. Living here meant accepting that privacy was an idea rather than a condition. If someone outside spoke loudly, you heard it. If someone inside moved a chair, the street knew. Light was scarce. Windows were small and cautious. They let in just enough daylight to remind you that the sun existed somewhere beyond the clouds. Most of the time, rooms relied on oil lamps whose glow softened edges but never truly banished shadow. Darkness did not arrive suddenly. It settled gradually and stayed. This constant dimness shaped behavior. People learned their homes by memory as much as sight. Hands found tables without looking. Feet avoided obstacles automatically. Clutter was dangerous not because it offended taste, but because it invited injury. Order mattered when light could not be trusted. The air told its own story. Cooking happened indoors over small fires or braziers. Lamps burned steadily. Smoke rose and lingered. Ceilings darkened. Walls absorbed years of soot. Clothing carried the scent. Hair held it. No one complained because there was no alternative. Warmth required fire, and fire produced smoke. This was not negligence. It was survival. Furniture remained minimal. A few stools, a low table, storage chests pressed against walls. Space had to change function constantly. A room used for work by day became a place for eating and sleeping by night. Beds were not fixed. Mats were rolled out and rolled away. Life adapted to available floor rather than demanding architecture adapt to life. And yet, despite all this, there was intention. Floors were often tiled or set with simple mosaics. Stone replaced mud. Clean surfaces replaced chaos. Stepping inside marked a transition. Outside lay rain and noise. Inside lay order, even if it was cramped and smoky. Roman identity began underfoot. Painted walls did more than decorate. They pretended. Reds and yellows suggested warmth that the climate refused to provide. Painted panels imitated stone that rarely existed here. This was not vanity. It was reassurance. Even in Britain, even under constant cloud, Rome could still look like itself if you tried hard enough. Maintenance was constant. Moisture crept into plaster. Paint flaked. Repairs never truly finished. Owning a decorated home meant accepting the beauty required patience. It also required optimism. You painted knowing the wall would crack again. You repaired knowing the rain would return. Noise never stopped. Walls carried sound easily. Footsteps echoed. Voices traveled. At night, the city grew quieter, but never silent. Someone was always awake. Someone always moved. Silence would have felt unnatural and possibly dangerous. Sound meant people were present and fires still burned. This closeness shaped social behavior. People learned to ignore what could not be changed. Arguments were heard but rarely pursued. Everyone knew too much about everyone else for drama to remain private. Gossip moved faster than carts. Reputation mattered because it traveled easily through walls. Sleep adapted to these conditions. It was light and interrupted. Families slept together not from sentiment, but necessity. Warmth gathered people into shared spaces. Dreams mixed with smoke and lamplight. Waking during the night was normal. Rest came in pieces. Animals shared space too. Dogs slept near fires. Cats moved freely hunting pests, attracted by stored food. Their presence was practical and accepted. A quiet house without animals would have felt oddly empty. Fire remained both friend and threat. Londinium burned easily. Rules existed and everyone knew them. Fires were watched carefully. Coals were banked at night. Water stayed nearby. Fear shaped routine quietly. No one needed reminding. Oil lamps ruled the evening. Their light was weak and precious. Oil was imported and valued. Lamps were lit where people gathered and nowhere else. Corners remained dark. Hallways stayed shadowed. People moved carefully. Light dictated behavior. Despite these limits, the lamplight transformed interiors. Painted walls looked richer. Stone floors reflected warmth. Shadows danced and made still rooms feel alive. Night improved the illusion even as smoke thickened. Darkness hid flaws daylight revealed. Hygiene followed similar logic. Most homes lacked private facilities. Waste moved through shared systems that worked sometimes and failed often. Water was used sparingly indoors. Washing happened in basins with cold water. Cleanliness meant management rather than perfection. Smell was unavoidable. Cooking smoke mixed with damp wood and wool. Nearby drains made their presence known. Visitors noticed. Residents adapted. The senses learned what to ignore. And still people insisted on living like Romans. They swept floors daily. They arranged furniture deliberately. They decorated even when practicality argued against it. These actions were not about comfort. They were about identity. Living in Londinium required compromise. Roman ideals of order and beauty collided daily with rain and crowding. Olive oil was precious. Space was shared. Privacy was rare. Yet routines continued. Lamps were lit, floors were swept, meals were prepared. This persistence mattered. A Londinium house was not just shelter. It was a statement. It declared that Rome could exist here not as a monument but as habit. You lived Roman by cooking Roman food on Roman tools and sleeping in Roman patterns, even when the climate objected. The house became a bridge between cultures. Local materials met imported ideas. Walls grew thicker, fires burned longer, routines shifted earlier. Rome bent rather than broke. Archaeology remembers this quietly. Broken lamps, worn tiles, soot-stained plaster. These fragments tell stories of ordinary lives adapting rather than conquering. The empire endured not only through roads and laws, but through thousands of small rooms where people insisted on familiarity. A Londinium house did not protect its occupants from noise, smoke, or damp very well. What it offered was continuity. In a distant province, continuity was power. It made foreign land feel manageable. By morning, the house looked ordinary again. Gray light pressed through shutters. Smoke hung faintly in the air. Floors waited to be swept. And the city prepared to enter once more. Rome did not arrive here with comfort. It arrived with habit. And in cramped rooms filled with smoke and sound, that habit learned how to survive. After Rome learned how to breathe indoors in Londinium, it learned something quieter and more controlling. It learned how to ration visibility. The house did not merely contain people, it organized them. And the tool responsible was small enough to hold in one hand. Oil lamps were not decorative objects here. They were instruments of decision. Where they burned, life gathered. Where they did not, space became irrelevant. A room could exist, in theory, yet vanish in practice if no flame was assigned to it. Darkness did not mean emptiness. It meant postponement. Light was used deliberately. Oil was imported. Every drop represented effort that had already traveled farther than most people ever would. As a result, lamps were lit with intention rather than optimism. You did not brighten a room simply because it existed. You brightened it because someone needed to see. The glow was modest. One lamp illuminated a circle rather than a space. Everything beyond that circle remained vague and suggestive. Edges softened. Corners disappeared. Furniture learned to behave because no one wanted to trip over it in low light. Order was enforced quietly by necessity. Families gathered around the light not because of sentiment, but because visibility mattered. Tasks required accuracy. Eating needed coordination. Sewing required eyes. Conversation followed naturally because mouths arrived where eyes already were. Romance was not the goal. Practicality was. The result was closeness without intimacy. People sat near one another without ceremony. Personal space surrendered to illumination. You learned more about others simply because you could see them better than anything else. Expressions became clearer. Gestures mattered. Silence felt heavier when faces were visible. Children learned this arrangement early. They played near the lamp because shadows offered little reward. Adults corrected them gently, not to wander into darkness where bumps and burns waited. The house trained behavior through light without raising its voice. Movement slowed at night, not out of fatigue alone, but because darkness demanded caution. You walked deliberately. You reached carefully. Speed belonged to daylight. Night belonged to precision. Oil lamps enforced this rhythm without complaint. Maintaining the light required constant attention. Wicks burned unevenly and demanded trimming. Too long, and smoke increased. Too short, and the flame weakened. Oil needed topping up, but never too much. A spill meant wasted effort and a mess that attracted dirt. Managing a lamp was an ongoing relationship rather than a task completed once. This responsibility shaped evenings. Someone always watched the flame, not formally, habitually. A glance here, a small adjustment there. The light stayed steady because people stayed aware. Fire was never background. It was always present. There was irony in how fragile this control was. A bumped table, a careless sleeve, a moment of distraction. The lamp could fall and the house would change instantly from shelter to threat. Everyone understood this risk. It sharpened attention. It also discouraged unnecessary movement. Dark areas of the house did not feel abandoned. They felt paused. Storage spaces waited patiently. Sleeping areas remained undefined until needed. The house became fluid. Light determined its shape hour by hour. This flexibility suited crowded living. Space did not belong permanently to anyone. It belonged temporarily to whoever held the light. Authority followed illumination. The person tending the lamp subtly guided the evening. When the lamp moved, people followed without discussion. Conversation clustered naturally, stories shortened, voices lowered, not because of reverence, but because sound carried strangely in dim rooms. Words felt heavier when faces were close and shadows listened. The light also softened imperfections. Painted walls looked richer, cracks faded, smoke stains blended into warmth. The illusion worked best at night. Daylight exposed flaws. Lamplight forgave them. Outside the rain continued. Inside the circle of light time slowed. Work became careful. Meals felt warmer. Even discomfort seemed manageable when edges blurred kindly. Darkness hid what could not be fixed. Yet light was not abundant. Decisions mattered. Do you keep the lamp burning or save oil for later? Do you finish this task now or leave it for morning? These choices shaped daily rhythm more than any written rule. Sleep approached gradually. Lamps dimmed rather than extinguished abruptly. Someone waited, someone watched. Darkness returned carefully. The house did not shut down. It softened. When the lamp finally went out, the house did not feel empty. It felt suspended. Shapes remained in memory. Pathways stayed known. People trusted familiarity more than sight. Morning would reverse the process. Light returned reluctantly through shutters. Lamps were cleaned. Wicks prepared. Oil measured. Night routines ended without ceremony. Late-night history lingers here because power rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives as a small flame deciding where bodies gather and where attention rests. In Londinium, oil lamps did not just illuminate rooms. They organized life quietly and completely. The empire reached into these homes not through law or spectacle, but through habit. By teaching people how to use light, it taught them how to share space and time. And that lesson endured longer than walls or paint. When Rome learned to breathe indoors, it also learned where to look. After circles of light decided where life happened, the rest of the house adjusted itself quietly. When the flame chose its circle, the walls and floors waited to be noticed. They did not compete for attention. They endured. In Londinium, endurance was the most reliable form of elegance. Painted walls were never meant to impress from a distance. They worked at close range. In narrow rooms where daylight struggled and smoke lingered, color did something practical. It softened confinement. Reds and yellows suggested warmth that the weather refused to provide. Pale panels created the illusion of space where none existed. These walls did not promise luxury, they promised effort. Paint was cheaper than stone and lighter than marble. It arrived with brushes rather than ships, and yet it carried a message that mattered deeply. This place belonged to order. Even if the roof leaked and the air smelled of smoke, the walls insisted on arrangement and intention. They declared that someone cared enough to make surfaces behave. The designs were not inventive. They repeated patterns known across the empire, panels imitating blocks, lines pretending to be columns, geometry doing most of the work. Originality was not the goal. Recognition was. A painted wall in Londinium wanted to look like a painted wall somewhere warmer and calmer. The resemblance mattered more than accuracy. Maintenance was constant. Moisture crept in, cracks appeared, paint flaked. This was not failure, it was routine. A wall that needed repair was a wall doing its job. People touched up damage without ceremony. Beauty here was not precious. It was persistent. Smoke tested everything. It rose from cooking fires and lamps and settled without apology. Bare plaster darkened quickly. Painted surfaces resisted better. Soot could be wiped away. Colors dulled but did not disappear. Cleanliness in Londinium meant choosing materials that tolerated reality. The floor completed this logic. Where the wall pretended upward, the floor anchored downward. Stone and tile replaced mud. Mosaic replaced guesswork. Stepping inside a house meant stepping onto something firm and deliberate. The outside world might slip and soak and smear itself everywhere. Inside the floor refused cooperation. Mosaic floors were not universal. They marked investment and discipline rather than wealth alone. Even simple tile patterns mattered. They were easy to sweep, resistant to damp, willing to survive boots, ash, and spilled food without complaint. In a climate that punished wood and fabric, stone learned to stay. Designs varied but shared purpose. Geometric patterns guided movement. Borders suggested transitions. Cooking areas separated themselves visually from sleeping spaces without walls. Feet learned where to go. Order existed without instruction. Walking barefoot in summer felt cool and grounding. Sandaled steps echoed lightly. Sound mattered. Stone announced presence without shouting. The floor participated in the house rather than merely supporting it. Cleaning became ritual. Sweeping daily removed not only dirt but anxiety. A clean floor suggested control even when everything else felt uncertain. Dirt outdoors was inevitable. Dirt indoors felt personal. There was irony here. A house filled with smoke and noise invested heavily in surfaces that pretended calm. But this was not denial. It was strategy. If the air could not be controlled, the ground would be. If sound traveled freely, the eye would rest on order. At night, lamplight transformed these surfaces. Paint deepened. Stone reflected warmth. Shadows danced along patterns and made flat designs feel alive. Imperfections softened. Daylight exposed limits. Night forgave them. People trusted these illusions. They needed to. Living in Londinium required cooperation with materials that behaved better than the weather. Walls and floors learned to absorb stress quietly. Even modest homes participated. A single painted panel, a small tiled area near the entrance. These gestures mattered. They marked the boundary between street and shelter. You did not need size to claim order. You needed intention. Visitors noticed floors before furniture. Feet always do. A stable surface communicated safety faster than words. In crowded neighborhoods where houses leaned close and sound passed easily, the floor offered certainty. These surfaces also carried memory. Repairs layered history. Chips and cracks told stories of years endured. Unlike wood that rotted or cloth that vanished, stone stayed to be counted. Late-night history lingers here because empires survive through habits rather than spectacle. Painted walls and mosaic floors were not symbols meant for outsiders. They were tools meant for residents. They made daily life tolerable. Rome did not conquer Britain by force alone. It taught people how to arrange rooms and clean floors and touch up walls. It taught them that order could exist even when comfort could not. After circles of light gathered bodies together, these surfaces gave them something steady to stand on and something calm to look at. The house breathed not because it was grand, but because it was arranged. In Londinium, civilization did not shout. It whispered through stone underfoot and paint at eye level. After order learned to wait patiently underfoot, the house revealed its less cooperative companions. Smoke and sound did not sit politely in corners or follow boundaries drawn by paint and stone. They moved freely. They lingered. They reminded everyone that living indoors in Londinium meant sharing space not only with people but with the consequences of keeping them warm and fed. Smoke was not an accident. It was an arrangement. Fires cooked food. Lamps made night usable. Braziers pushed back damp cold that seeped through walls and floors without apology. To live meant to burn something. To burn something meant to breathe it in. There was no negotiation here. Smoke became a resident rather than a visitor. It gathered near ceilings first, then it spread. It softened outlines, it darkened beams. It settled into fabric and hair and lungs. After enough time, it stopped being noticed directly. It became background like rain on a roof. People learned which corners trapped it and which doors helped it drift away. They adjusted furniture not for beauty but for airflow. The house smelled lived in before anyone spoke. Cooking fires left their trace long after the meal was finished. Oil lamps added their own signature. Even clean homes carried the faint reminder that warmth had a cost. Fresh air existed mostly as memory. Noise followed a similar logic. Walls were thin. Floors carried sound. Stairways echoed. A cough in one room became public knowledge. A dropped pot announced itself to the street. Silence was rare and therefore suspicious. During the day, noise blended into purpose. Work explained sound. At night, it changed character. Each noise felt closer. A footstep carried farther. A voice lingered. The house did not grow quiet. It grew intimate. Sleep adapted rather than resisted. People did not expect to disappear when they lay down. They expected to fold themselves into whatever space remained usable. Mats rolled out where the floor allowed. Beds shifted nightly. Sleeping was not a fixed location, but a temporary agreement. Families slept together because warmth gathered bodies efficiently. Blankets were heavy and shared. Privacy mattered less than heat. Children curled near adults. Adults positioned themselves near dying embers. No one pretended this was ideal. It was sufficient. Smoke lingered through the night. Fires were banked, not extinguished. Warmth mattered more than clean air. People slept lightly, breathing adjusted. Waking during the night was normal. A cough did not signal illness. It signaled life continuing. Sound never truly stopped. A neighbor shifted. Someone rose early. Rain struck roofs. Animals moved inside. Dogs settled and resettled. Cats crossed beams. The city pressed gently against every wall, reminding occupants they were not alone. This constant presence shaped sleep itself. Rest came in layers. Short stretches accumulated rather than extended periods. Dreams mixed easily with waking sound. There was no sharp boundary between asleep and awake. Night existed on a spectrum. The irony was that this closeness offered security. Silence would have meant danger, fire out, illness, abandonment. Noise meant people were present. Smoke meant warmth still lived. These discomforts were proof that life continued nearby. People learned where to sleep through experience. The floor near the hearth was warmer but smokier. Higher platforms caught less smoke but more draft. Corners offered shelter from footsteps but trapped sound. Every position had trade-offs. Choosing where to sleep was a practical calculation. Sleeping arrangements changed with seasons. Winter compressed bodies inward. Summer allowed slight distance. Rain altered everything. Damp air carried sound differently. Smoke behaved unpredictably. The house responded nightly. There was little ceremony around bedtime. Lamps dimmed gradually. Conversations faded rather than ended. Someone trimmed a wick. Someone banked coals. The house shifted posture without announcement. Night arrived not as an event, but as a lowering of activity. Children learned these rhythms early. They fell asleep amid voices. They woke to movement. Sleep trained them to tolerate interruption. Resilience formed quietly. A child who could rest through noise would survive here. The house itself never slept. Smoke rose and fell. Sounds passed through. The structure held everything without judgment. It was not a refuge from the city. It was the city compressed. Late-night history lingers in these moments because this is how ordinary life endured empire and climate without drama. People did not conquer smoke or silence noise. They learned how to live alongside both. In Londinium, sleep was not escape. It was participation at a lower volume. Bodies rested while awareness remained nearby. This light sleep suited a world where fire could turn dangerous and neighbors lived close enough to matter. Morning arrived early. Light returned reluctantly. Mats rolled up. Bedding aired if weather allowed. The floor reclaimed its role. The walls waited. Smoke thinned slightly. Noise shifted back into purpose. The night left no monument, only tired bodies and familiar smells, and the quiet understanding that rest did not require comfort. It required adaptation. After order learned to stand firm underfoot, the house taught its occupants a deeper lesson. You do not control everything. You adjust. You breathe what you must. You sleep where you can. And life continues anyway. In Londinium, the night did not erase the day. It folded it carefully and waited for morning to unfold it again. 4. Before history learned her name, Boudica learned weight. Not metaphorical weight, real weight. The kind that pulls at the arms when water is carried too far. The kind that shifts underfoot when cattle decide to move at the wrong moment. The kind that teaches balance long before anyone thinks to teach authority. She did not grow up in a world designed to protect children from difficulty. Among her people, childhood was not a separate room. It was the edge of the same space adults occupied. Smaller bodies moved through the same weather. Smaller hands learned the same tasks. Mistakes were corrected immediately, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The land did not forgive ignorance. Cattle were not symbols. They were wealth that breathed. They walked away if unattended. They fell sick. They needed guarding. A family could count its future in hooves and hides rather than objects. Losing an animal was not abstract loss. It was missing food, missing trade, missing security. Children learned this early because loss was visible. Boudica would have known which animals belonged to which family and why that mattered. She would have heard arguments about boundaries and theft and responsibility long before she understood politics. Wealth was not hidden in chests. It grazed nearby and required attention. Power lived in protection and care rather than accumulation. Work was constant, carrying water, gathering fuel, watching herds, standing in cold rain without ceremony. No one praised endurance. It was expected. Complaining changed nothing and wasted breath better used elsewhere. Strength formed quietly in bodies that did not consider themselves heroic. Girls were not spared this work. They learned the same rhythms, the same patience, the same awareness of weather and ground. Gender did not excuse inability. A capable person mattered more than a delicate one. Frailty was not romantic. It was inconvenient. Authority in this world was practical. People listened to those who managed resources well, those who remembered boundaries, those who kept others fed. Leadership was visible in action rather than title. Children absorbed this without instruction. They watched who spoke last and who was obeyed. Stories mattered. Evenings carried memory. Elders recited names and places and past disputes. These were not entertainment, they were maps. Knowing where something happened mattered because land remembered. Forgetting meant losing claim. Children learned geography through story rather than writing. Women were present in these memories, not hidden, not exceptional. They appeared as decision-makers, negotiators, defenders of kin. This shaped expectation quietly. Authority did not arrive with surprise. It arrived when circumstances demanded it. Roman presence entered this world gradually, at first as objects. Metal that behaved differently, vessels that suggested other habits, coins that did not graze or reproduce. To children, these items were curious. To adults, they were unsettling. Value that did not breathe felt untrustworthy. Pressure followed. Roads cut through land. Soldiers appeared without apology. Rules arrived without context. Authority that did not grow from memory or labor demanded compliance anyway. Children noticed the shift before they understood it. Voices lowered. Decisions took longer. Hospitality became cautious. Boudica grew up inside this tightening space. Her childhood did not include innocence in the modern sense. It included awareness. She learned that power could arrive without consent, that obedience could be demanded by strangers, that compromise often meant erosion rather than peace. Women noticed these changes sharply. Roman expectations differed. Authority moved indoors. Voices softened. Presence narrowed. For a culture accustomed to visible female strength, this felt like contraction. Identity hardened in response. What outsiders dismissed as improper became deliberate. Adolescence arrived without ceremony. Expectation increased. Reliability mattered more than enthusiasm. A young woman learned when to speak and when to wait. Loudness without purpose damaged credibility. Silence used well built it. Boudica learned this balance early. Physical presence mattered. Height and composure carried weight in gatherings. But presence alone was insufficient. Judgment mattered more. Watching elders negotiate under pressure taught restraint. Power that could not adapt broke quickly. Marriage entered as strategy. Alliances mattered. Resources shifted hands deliberately. Romance was irrelevant. Stability mattered. Boudica understood that partnership expanded influence rather than reduced it. Authority grew through responsibility. Children followed. Motherhood sharpened everything. What had once been abstract became immediate. Land mattered because it fed children. Autonomy mattered because inheritance depended on it. Roman demands now threatened futures rather than pride alone. Client status offered conditional peace. Autonomy existed as long as it remained useful. Respect arrived temporarily. Boudica learned that granted power was fragile. What could be given could be taken. This lesson settled deeply. Her upbringing did not teach rebellion directly. It taught clarity. It taught where authority came from and where it did not. It taught that power divorced from responsibility was unstable, that survival required memory and endurance rather than noise. Late-night history lingers here because the figure remembered later was shaped long before conflict announced itself. Boudica did not rise suddenly. She arrived already prepared by years of watching weight shift, from cattle to coin and from land to law. Her childhood was not dramatic. It was formative. It built a person who understood that strength was not shouting. It was standing. It was holding ground. It was refusing to forget. When later events forced choice upon her, she did not invent resolve. She recognized it. It had been there since childhood, in the rain, in the fields, among animals that breathed and walked and taught responsibility without speaking. History often prefers moments. Late-night history prefers preparation. Boudica was shaped long before anyone wrote her name down. After Boudica learned weight before words, she learned something quieter and far more permanent. She learned that strength did not need explanation. It did not arrive with speeches or ceremony. It stood in plain sight and waited to be recognized. In her world, women were not symbols. They were participants. They worked. They managed. They decided. This was not remarkable enough to comment on. It was ordinary. A woman who could not carry her share was a problem. A woman who could was simply reliable. Capability was not praised loudly because it did not require applause. It required results. Work erased abstraction. Tasks needed doing regardless of who performed them. Animals required attention. Resources required guarding. Decisions needed making quickly and correctly. The land did not pause for discussion. Competence became the only acceptable language. Authority grew from repetition. Someone who handled responsibility well gained trust. Someone who failed lost it. Gender did not protect incompetence. It also did not disqualify skill. Strength was measured by steadiness rather than display. Children absorbed this logic early. They watched women organize households. They saw disputes resolved by those who knew the details rather than those who spoke the loudest. Influence belonged to memory and endurance rather than volume. There was no performance of empowerment here. No need to declare presence. Women were present because survival required them to be. Their authority was practical and therefore difficult to challenge. This visibility shaped behavior. A woman did not need permission to act. She acted because action was necessary. Waiting for approval would have been inefficient and possibly dangerous. The community accepted this because efficiency mattered. Roman observers would later misunderstand this structure. Accustomed to quieter forms of female influence, they interpreted visibility as disorder. They mistook participation for impropriety. What they labeled excessive was simply functional. Within the tribe, no such confusion existed. Strength that could be seen was trusted. Strength that hid itself behind words was treated cautiously. A person who spoke well but failed to deliver quickly lost credibility. This created a culture of standing rather than arguing. You proved yourself by doing. You remained standing by continuing to do it well. Reputation was built slowly and eroded quickly. Everyone understood this. Boudica grew within this system. She did not need to imagine authority. She watched it daily. She learned that leadership was not a destination. It was a condition maintained through effort. Women managed resources openly. They negotiated. They remembered obligations. They enforced boundaries. Their voices carried weight because they were attached to action. Silence did not imply absence. It implied focus. This environment taught restraint. Speaking unnecessarily weakened position. Speaking accurately strengthened it. Words followed action rather than replacing it. Ironically, this made conflict rarer. When authority was clear, arguments shortened, decisions happened. Energy returned to survival rather than persuasion. Roman influence complicated this balance. External authority arrived demanding obedience without shared memory. Orders came from distance rather than experience. This unsettled everyone. Women felt this pressure immediately. Their visible authority contrasted sharply with Roman expectations. What had been normal became contested. Strength that had required no defense now attracted scrutiny. The response was not loud resistance, it was persistence. Women continued to work and manage and decide because stopping would have harmed everyone. Their authority did not escalate, it endured. Boudica observed this carefully. She saw that strength did not need to confront misunderstanding directly. It only needed to continue functioning. Systems collapse when they stop working. Her world did not stop. This shaped her later presence. She did not rely on rhetoric, she relied on recognition. When she stood, people already knew what standing meant. It meant responsibility had arrived. Late-night history lingers here because this is where power actually lives. Not in dramatic confrontation, but in daily visibility. Strength that is seen regularly stops needing explanation. Boudica did not rise as an exception. She emerged as a continuation. The society around her had already decided that standing firm was ordinary. She simply stood when circumstances demanded it. This made later events feel inevitable rather than shocking. A woman speaking with authority did not break tradition. It fulfilled it. History often looks for moments of transformation. Late-night history notices continuity. Boudica was shaped by a world where women were already doing the work of survival, openly and without apology. When strength is visible, it becomes normal. And when it is normal, it becomes powerful. No announcement was required. After strength learned to stand without announcement, the world around it began to tighten. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Pressure arrived the way weather does, gradually enough that people adjusted posture before they named the discomfort. Roman presence did not begin with shouting. It began with visibility. Roads appeared where paths had been informal. Soldiers stood where none had stood before. Laws arrived already written. None of this required immediate reaction. That was the problem. It simply stayed. Conversation changed first, not content. Tone. Voices lowered when unfamiliar ears were nearby. Jokes shortened. Disagreements ended faster than usual. People learned which topics were safe to leave unfinished. This was not fear in the theatrical sense. It was calculation. Children noticed before adults admitted it. They watched how gatherings shifted, how elders paused mid-sentence, how hospitality became careful rather than open. No one announced new rules. Behavior adapted without instruction. Movement changed as well. Travel required explanation. Visits required reason. Roads that promised convenience also promised observation. The land felt narrower, even though nothing physical had moved. Authority began to feel layered. Local decisions still mattered, but now existed beneath something heavier. Roman demands arrived with confidence that did not require understanding local memory. Compliance was expected, not negotiated. This altered daily rhythm. Tasks took longer. Decisions waited. People learned patience that had nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with survival. Acting too quickly attracted attention. Acting too slowly risked consequences. Balance mattered. Women felt this shift acutely. Their visible authority had always been practical. Now it was observed differently. Actions that once passed without comment became noteworthy. Visibility carried weight it had not carried before. The response was subtle, not withdrawal, adjustment. Women continued to manage resources and households because stopping would have harmed everyone. They learned when to step forward and when to let silence work. Strength refined itself. Boudica grew into this atmosphere. She did not experience oppression as an event. She experienced it as pressure that accumulated. Every interaction required awareness. Every decision carried an extra consideration. This environment trained judgment. Loud defiance would have been impractical. Quiet persistence worked better. Identity hardened through repetition rather than proclamation. Roman systems preferred clarity. They labeled and measured. Local systems preferred memory. They remembered rather than recorded. This mismatch created tension that never needed words. Children learned caution without instruction. They learned which adults spoke freely and which did not. They learned that authority could arrive from outside without context. They learned that compliance did not always mean agreement. The land itself felt altered. Roads connected but also constrained. Forts promised order but delivered presence. Safety arrived paired with surveillance. This combination unsettled communities accustomed to managing themselves. There was no single moment of realization, no speech, no revolt yet. Just the steady understanding that autonomy was narrowing. Late night history sits here because this is where transformation actually begins. Not in flames or declarations, but in habits that shift quietly. When behavior changes, destiny often follows without needing explanation. Boudica did not grow up dreaming of confrontation. She grew up learning how pressure reshapes conduct. She watched people adjust before they resisted. She learned that when space tightens, standing still becomes a choice rather than default. Irony lived in the calm. Roman order promised stability while creating unease. Its confidence invited compliance while breeding resentment. People behaved because they had to, not because they believed. This tension did not break immediately. It stretched. Generations felt it increasing like a cord, pulled slowly. Each day alone was manageable. Accumulated, they became something else. By the time action became reasonable, it no longer felt sudden. It felt logical. Behavior had already prepared the ground. Silence had already taught limits. Adjustment had already revealed where pressure could no longer be absorbed. Standing without announcement had trained strength. Pressure without noise trained resolve. When those two finally met, action required no drama. Late night history does not rush this moment. It lets it settle. because understanding how fate becomes reasonable begins long before fate arrives. 3. As the night loosens its grip, nothing asks to be concluded. There is no lesson waiting at the edge of sleep, no final thought that needs to be carried forward. These moments were never meant to arrive anywhere. They were meant to pass through you quietly, like rain easing without announcement, like footsteps fading once they are no longer needed. History, when spoken softly, does not demand agreement. It does not insist on meaning. It simply shows how people adjusted, how cities learned when to slow, how strength learned when to stop pushing, how leaving became easier than insisting. If you are still listening, that is enough. If you have drifted already, that is also enough. Nothing here needs to be remembered sharply. These stories work best when they blur at the edges, when they sink into the background where the body understands them without effort. The night has done its work now. It has lowered voices, shortened steps, softened the urge to explain. Before you let go completely, know this. If this quiet helped you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to return whenever you need it again. There is no schedule here, no expectation, only the continuation of nights like this one. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle. It allows these hours to remain unhurried. It lets the stories keep arriving without raising their voice. And if you choose not to return, that is fine too. Leaving is part of the rhythm. The city learned that long ago. So did history. Now the lanterns lower, the streets empty, the smoke thins. What remains does not ask for attention. Let the night finish what it started. Let the thoughts settle where they want to settle. Let sleep arrive without ceremony. Good night.